Thank you all for coming out on this balmy Canberra evening. In order to welcome you properly, I'll ask the President of the Academy of the Social Sciences, Professor Glenn Withers, to step to the microphone.
Thanks so much, John, and thanks so much to everybody for coming along this evening on a crisp Canberra night. Indeed, crisp is an appropriate word to be using. I just read the other day that when the Academy of Social Sciences was formed, Professor Finn Crisp refused to join because he felt the term fellow was gendered, which was very prescient at the time. So let's bear that in mind. Our diversity committee is meeting soon, so it's among the things we have to pursue. But most important is to begin, though, with acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past and present, and we extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who might be in attendance today. This is an evening organised by the Academy of Social Sciences. For those who aren't members of the Academy, there's a sprinkling of the fellows of the Academy around the room, but many others too. And it's one of the four so-called learned academies recognised by government, along with the Academy of Science and the Australian Academy of Humanities and the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering, which these days also form a group that you may not be so familiar with, called the Australian Council of Learned Academies, ACOLA is the acronym, which tries to actually produce long-wanted cooperation between the different approaches to knowledge, and in particular to pursue interdisciplinary knowledge. One of the great challenges to people who have at least a university background, when all our members aren't necessarily university people, but the university ones find it particularly difficult to cope with interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity, even within areas like social sciences or humanities, let alone across those sometime divides. But we are seeking to advance that area as we are the diversity of our membership. And indeed, these days we begin to see ourselves in a slightly new light, which is as a sort of counterweight to the managerialism that's very evident in our universities in particular, in how they approach and develop their knowledge, important and valid as it is, but some with the massification of higher education, which for by and large can be a great thing, but in many cases has dysfunction as well. So the academies have begun to see themselves as wanting to be a little bit more active in representing some other scholarly values that perhaps get lost in a managerial era. So we're gradually changing ourselves, but as is the wont of university types, the emphasis might be upon gradual, but it is happening. Tonight we are here though for the Keith Hancock Lecture, and that's named in honour of Emeritus Professor Keith Hancock, who's been a Fellow of the Academy since 1968, was President in the period of 81 to 84, and this annual lecture was inaugurated in his honour in 2009, and Academy Fellows invited each year to nominate somebody to present an honour under his name, and we're absolutely delighted tonight because we've got Professor Hancock and his partner Sue Richardson, also a former president of the Academy. So having two previous presidents of the Academy here is a nice thing, and on the occasion of the Keith Hancock Lecture, the appropriate thing. Keith himself, you've probably got some background, but was a graduate of Melbourne University. That was in the days before Monash was founded. And as I'm a graduate of Monash, you see, and the London School of Economics, and was Foundation Professor of Economics at Flinders University, later Vice-Chancellor of Flinders University, and after that, in turn, a Deputy President of what was then the Australian Conciliation and Arbitration Commission, and went through various guises of its transmogrifications, retiring, as it were, in 1997, retaining affiliations with Flinders and Adelaide and the LSE, and was made an Officer of the Order of Australia. So you can see why it's very appropriate that we at this Academy want to reflect the achievements of Keith in these matters. Some of you who are of a certain age may, of course, if you haven't followed his career as closely, thought of confusing him with Sir Keith Hancock. And I'm of an age where I actually knew Sir Keith when he was the Foundation Director of the Research School of Social Sciences at ANU. So we've got Keith the Younger tonight rather than Keith the Elder, and we're pleased in this Academy to recognise Keith the Younger through this lecture. The lecturer tonight also is obviously, I'm sure, well known to you because you wouldn't probably be here otherwise. But Dr. Richard Dennis is very well known in the community of public discussion and university work and in political spheres as well. And I've known Richard for a substantial amount of time myself and in a variety of posts. He's been over the other side of the lake in Parliament and during various times in his career, as well as over this side of the lake, and we taught together in the same department at ANU for some time. He's still an adjunct professor in the Crawford School here at ANU, and is known much more widely than that, though, because of much of his public work. You occasionally see him on those television shows. You also read his works in the Australian Financial Review and in the Canberra Times, and also you may have read some of his work in the book called Affluenza that he wrote with Clive Hamilton, as well as more recently the book Econobabble, which was launched last year, I think. So a very appropriate person for us this evening on the topic of a model of confusion why economic modelling is ruining public policy and public debate and what can be done about it. So if I could invite Richard to take the platform and guide us through his thoughts on these matters. Please, Richard.
Well, thank you very much, Glenn, and to the Academy for inviting me tonight, and for you all for coming out. I think I met you in 2000, Glenn. Maybe it was 2001, and we started teaching. Well, you took a chance on me as a escapee from Newcastle Uni. You let me at the ANU students on a course on economic policy. And to some extent, what I'm going to talk about tonight is these ideas have been kicking around in my mind ever since then, because I must admit, once upon a time I was an economist. I didn't know what policy was. Policy seemed to be something that other people did. But when I moved to Canberra, I figured out that it had something to do with economics. So thank you, Glenn, and thank you all for inviting me. And it really is an honour to give the Keith Hancock oration. I just think that Keith is a giant of the Australian economic community, particularly in relation to industrial relations. And my wife said tonight, "Oh, tell me more about this talk you're giving." I said, "Oh, it's the Keith Hancock oration." She said, "Oh, tell me about him." And I said, "Oh, he wrote the book on economics." And she said, "Oh, which one?" I said, "Economics. It's called Economics." And Keith, with Samuelson and Wallace, wrote literally the book on economics. Keith was also, as you heard, the founding professor of economics at Flinders and a kind of permanent presence in the Australian economic landscape. So, congratulations on all that you've achieved, and I genuinely am humbled to come here tonight and give the Keith Hancock oration. So the topic of my talk tonight, and the mic is on. Yeah, it is, but I didn't turn it on, I just realised. So am I doing all right? He's shrugging his shoulders. I think I've got another mic, but I forgot to turn it on. The topic of my talk tonight is, I think, an important one, and that is the role of economic modelling in modern policy debates, in modern economic debates. And again, once upon a time, I didn't really know there was an overlap between the two, but the economic modelling that we hear so much has become, I think, a central part of the way we talk about the economy, and worse, or more importantly, the way we talk about what we as a society can or can't do. That, abstract as it is, I think it's a very important topic. So I want to talk about that, but before I do, I guess I just want to emphasise that I think economics is very important. I've studied economics, I've practiced economics. I'm not here tonight to say economics or economic modelling is stupid, far from it. I think it's important. And the first principles in economics, the first class that we usually teach students is about opportunity cost. We teach people that every time you do something, you give up the chance to do something else, and that if there's scarce resources, we don't want to waste them. So we describe economics as the science of the efficient allocation of scarce resources. This is the stuff we teach our first year students. So we've got this science that's supposed to help us with efficiency, and not wasting resources is allegedly central to what we do in economics. But part of what I want to talk about tonight is the enormous opportunity cost, the consumption of resources that now goes into fights about economic modelling, which are actually sucking the oxygen out of fights about what kind of society we want to have, what kind of things we want to have more of and less of. All of the talk about economic modelling, I'll build the case I hope tonight, suggests that rather than helping us as citizens or our elected representatives participate in a contest of ideas or a contest of values, I think instead we're wasting an enormous amount of time talking about what the economic modelling says. Now, of course, this leaves me open to the suggestion I'm wasting your time now by talking about economic modelling, when instead I could be talking about something more important. But I fear that this modelling is now just getting in the way of so much that we could be talking about. So let's go backwards before we go forwards. Keith was president of the Academy in 1981 to 1984 and became a member of the Academy in 1968. Now, you wouldn't know it, but I wasn't born then. I know I look young, but I wasn't born then. I was born in 1981. I was in primary school, and by 84 I was in high school. So let's go back to that era and ask ourselves what was going on. We had tumultuous public debates about economic reform. Arguably, people hark back to this Hawke-Keating era of reform all the time. Well, let's be clear, they floated the dollar without economic modelling. Most of those big economic debates that people hark back to weren't debates about modelling. They were debates about economics. They were debates about risk. They were debates about Australia's place in the world. They were big, important public policy debates. But it wasn't people waving modelling around. It was political leaders and political leaders from all sides, and unions and other organisations and academics putting themselves out there in a contest of ideas. It wasn't people waving economic modelling reports about what it would do to GDP in 30 years' time. It wasn't tables in the Telegraph where you could figure out how many kids you've got and what your income was to read off what the impact on you was going to be. So this golden age, allegedly, of when we could do big policy, let's be clear, we did it without any economic modelling. But let's pretend we did do modelling back then. Let's pretend we tried to model the Australian economy in 1983, 1984, looking forward to 2016, looking forward to whether floating the dollar would lead to an increase in GDP or a decrease, an increase in jobs and investment or a decrease. Imagine the economic model that we could have had in 1983, projecting out 30 years, the number of people working in the internet industry at zero. The number of people working in the mobile phone industry Zero. Right? We have no capacity. I don't think anyone in the room is going to argue with me about this. We have no capacity as economists, theoretical economists, people interested in policy, modelers. We have zero capacity to predict the future. None. We can project from trend a bit, sometimes. We cannot predict the future. We can't predict the oil price in 6 months' time. We can't predict interest rates in 6 months' time. Right? We have no idea what's going to happen to the macroeconomy in Australia, let alone globally, in the next 6 years. And despite the incredible imprecision of attempts to project what budget aggregates will look like in 4 years' time, having spectacularly failed, we've now shifted the debate to what will it look like in 10 years' time. And unfortunately, both the 4-year forecasts and the 10-year forecasts are hiding the one thing we do know, and that's what's happening this year. But the one thing that's interesting and important about the budget is this year, what are we spending more money on and what are we spending less money on? Right? The budget is the summation of our collective priorities. And we increase spending on things we want to increase spending on. We reduce spending on things we want to reduce spending on. We put taxes on things we want to put taxes on. And there it all is. And the 12-month forecasts are pretty good. And no one's paying any attention to that because we're talking about what's going to happen in 4 years or remarkably in 10 years. Well, let's be clear. We had a GFC in 2008 that wasn't in the 2007 budget papers. Wasn't in the 2006 budget papers. It wasn't in the 2005 budget papers. Turns out all the out years were out. All right? That's what an out year is. So this doesn't mean that we can't and shouldn't think about the future and think about how policy change today might affect the future. I think that's very important and useful. But we've kind of got ourselves stuck in this trap that the only legitimate way to talk about the future is through modelling, and the more precise the modelling, the more accurate it must be. When, of course, there's no link at all between claims of precision and accuracy. So have a look at the intergenerational report, have a look at the budget papers, look at the things with decimal places. And the more, no, it's not me, it'd be my mum. The more decimal places you see, the wronger it's going to be. But you're not allowed in public policy to say, well, we've got no idea what's coming up, but I think more of this and less of this would be appropriate. So let's talk now briefly about exactly what we mean. What is an economic model and why does it matter? Why care? One reason to care is because important people care, powerful people care. Powerful people wave modelling around these days. So that's a reason to care. But intellectually we should care because models are an attempt to simplify something complex and multifaceted. Done well, a model is simply a simplification of a complex system. And if we simplify in good ways, we can get really powerful predictions out of quite simple models. So, for example, when I was studying physics in year 12, we learned about how cannonballs move through vacuums. Anyone here do that version of physics? And you know the velocity when it leaves the cannon and the angle, and you can figure out where it's going to land. Well, that version of physics is really simple, and it's actually useful for people who don't own cannons. Right? Because actually having some notion of trajectory in physics is really quite handy. Let's test this. Glenn, look at that. Fantastic. I just did some differential calculus in my head. I didn't really. I just threw something and I kind of knew what the trajectory would be like. So well done, Glenn. You caught that. So, look at that. Thank you very much. It gets better. Gets better. Now, this doesn't look like a cannonball, I hope. But because the mass of this pen is significant relative to the size of its surface area, we can ignore the fact that it's not a perfect sphere. And because it's not a perfect sphere doesn't mean the model, the simple Newtonian model's rubbish, but it means that for things like chucking a pen at Glenn, I can use a simple model pretty effectively. But the simple model that tells me about how things move when I throw them doesn't work for a paper aeroplane. And it really, really doesn't work when I try to throw that. Now, Newtonian physics works for bits of paper. It really does. But the reason I have no ability to predict where that'll land is because for a bit of paper that's flexible, not like my pen, and doesn't weigh much, fluid dynamics dominate Newtonian physics. I know nothing about fluid dynamics, but I know that fluid dynamics means I can't predict where a bit of paper will land. So the Newtonian simplification that you can ignore friction when trying to figure out where a cannonball or a pen will land, that simplification is fine when the simple model is used appropriately. It's not the simplicity of the model that's good or bad, it's the appropriateness. Using a model that's appropriate for the question. Now let's jump to economic models. We've got really simple economic models that sometimes really simple economic models can give us some really simple but powerful conclusions. All right, so we've got simple models about how consumers respond to changes in price. We've got simple models about how to optimise under constraint. There's all sorts of simple stuff in Keith's book, Economics. All right, and there's plenty of simple models that are really useful, like the pen. The problem isn't the simple models. The problem is when simple models get used inappropriately. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. So to be clear, it's not the simplifications that are the problem. It's the choice of inappropriate models that are the problem. So let's talk about what some of these what some of these simple assumptions are. So we, for example, in Australia now, when we want to analyse something like the carbon tax or the mining tax or an increase in wages, you name it, any significant policy change, cutting the corporate tax rate, which I'll come to, we typically these days go to economic modellers, and the economic modellers tell us what the model says will happen. And we know, for example, that some people's models of the carbon price said, yeah, it's trivial. You probably won't be able to find it in the time series data. And other people's models said it'll be a wrecking ball through the economy. Well, two different groups modelling the same phenomena came up with entirely different answers. Why? Because they used different assumptions. And I'll come to this perhaps at the end, they presented their data really quite differently. So if we can't, as a profession, as economists, if we can't say for certain which assumptions are the appropriate ones to use when modelling something like a carbon price, then how can we tell people what the answer is, what the truth is? Now, the fact that we don't know for certain doesn't mean, again, that the models couldn't perform an important role. If, and this is a big if, we wanted to use modelling to help people, to help the public, to help policymakers get to the bottom of things, then the modellers would be entirely upfront about the big assumptions. You'd find the assumptions right at the front of the report saying, we've assumed that small changes in the price of energy will have a really big impact on the demand for certain goods. Well, that's an assumption about the elasticity of demand. We think the elasticity of demand is large. And if you put a smaller number in, that would have a big impact on our modelling results. There's no reason we can't put the assumptions up front. There's no reason we can't have sensitivity analysis. Excuse me, I'll come to this at the end. But of course, that's not what happens. Right? The models kind of make these point estimate predictions and say, if this policy comes in, and Bruce Chapman's around here somewhere. Where's Bruce? Bruce, can you remember the name of that paper that you wrote on the number of jobs lost with the carbon tax? It's 23,492 or... Yeah, all right. So the mining industry had claimed that the carbon tax was going to cost 23,510 jobs. Not 23,500, not 23,509, 23,510. Absolute rubbish. But of course the precision makes people think no one would tell that big a lie. Like, no one would make up. There's 24 million Australians. Like, we're at 4 decimal places here, yet still there they are with the 510. So I just want to talk a bit about, so the point is that the fact that we don't know something, the fact that we're not sure exactly how strong some of the relationships we want to model is, doesn't itself mean we shouldn't do some modelling. It doesn't mean that at all, but we should be honest about what we don't know. We should talk about how sensitive the final result is to some of the things we don't know. But that's not the way modelling's played out. So let me give you a few other examples. One of the most, I think, intellectually dishonest and approaches to economic modelling relies on what are called input-output tables or input-output models. And these were used very regularly in the last 15 years to make big claims about how a project would create tens of thousands of indirect jobs. This sort of came to its nadir or zenith, depending on your perspective, when Rio Tinto claimed that the extension of a small mine in the Hunter Valley would create 44,000 new jobs. Now, there's only 500,000 people that live in the Hunter Valley, and the extension of a small mine was going to create 44,000 new jobs. My colleagues and I from the Australia Institute argued in that court case, and it's important here, this was a court case, under oath, that we thought the mine would create 0 new jobs. So we had Rio Tinto at 44,000 and us at 0, and we won. We won that case. So they appealed, and we won. So the New South Wales government changed the planning law, and now they're building the mine. But that's not the point, not tonight's point at least. The point is that the 44,000 jobs claim came from these input-output tables, which under oath they had to admit assume the existence of a ghost labour force of highly skilled labour that in the middle of a mining boom was standing around waiting for a job offer. Okay, so this was a proposal to build or extend a small mine in the Hunter Valley in the mining boom. And one of the assumptions in input-output models is that there's unlimited supply of scarce resources. Now remember what I said at the beginning economics was about? The efficient allocation of scarce resources? It's a bit weird to use a model that assumes there's unlimited resources. So with these input-output models, there's unlimited supply of skilled labour, so these new projects generate these enormous multiplier effects, which in reality what happens is when one of these projects goes ahead, it poaches skilled labour from another project. It's not rocket science, it's actually economics 101. But for 10 years, these models were used in public debate and accepted very widely by public sector departments, state and federal, taken verbatim as claims of economic benefits. So you don't see that so much anymore. The input-output models have been killed off in the last couple of years, which is good. And that's moved us now to these kind of fancier models, CGE models, computable general equilibrium models. And to be clear, they're better than input-output models. There's no doubt about that. But, well, the fact that they're better doesn't mean that they're not contestable, and it certainly doesn't mean that they can predict the future, because none of us can. Now, the CGE models are far more complicated than the input-output models, and unfortunately that means that they are far less transparent. Very few people know what's inside of them. Indeed, some of them are deemed commercial in confidence It's genuinely a black box. You're not allowed to look inside. But these models, black box or simply opaque and hard to understand, are systematically used in our public debate these days to make the point that if policy X were to go ahead, the winners would outweigh the losers, or vice versa, depending on which side of the argument you're on. So to give you some examples of the sort of strangeness of these CGE models, again, if you bury into them, you find these assumptions, which, again, the fact that they have simplifying assumptions isn't the problem. The question is, are the simplifying assumptions appropriate for the problem we're trying to solve? So, one of my favourite examples of this, the Adani Carmichael mine up in Queensland. If it goes ahead, it'll be the largest coal export mine ever built. If you went to the top of Sydney Tower and you looked to the horizon, you wouldn't see the end of this mine. If you can, picture a hole in the ground 45 kilometres long. It's the biggest hole, one of the biggest holes the world would ever build. The modellers who were analysing the impact of this model on the Australian economy assumed that building the world's biggest export coal mine would have no impact on the world price of coal. The modellers building the model for this assumed that not only wouldn't it have any impact on the price of coal, bizarrely, and you'd have to email me if you want all the transcript for this, they actually assumed that building the world's largest coal mine, export coal mine, would lead to a reduction in the supply of coal. Building the world's largest export coal mine would lead to a reduction in the world's supply of coal. Seem ridiculous? I thought so too. But was that kind of revealed on page 1? No, not quite. So you can ask me about it in questions if you want. My point is, and that's all, by the way, the fun part, we liked having these arguments in court because lying to journalists is funny and lying to judges is a crime. So when we have economic debates in court, we actually get some honest answers out of the modellers. When you try to have these debates in public debate, first up, they won't answer at all, or second, they just make things up. But under oath, we know that the people that modelled the construction of the world's largest export coal mine said that if it went ahead, the world's supply of coal would fall. Now, what I want to focus on tonight is, so A, big picture assumptions matter. B, the assumptions I want to focus on now are the way that we in the economics profession are modelling the way the labour market works, something that Professor Hancock knows a little bit about. Because buried in these CGE models, these computable general equilibrium models, are all sorts of assumptions about how humans behave, how we behave in the labour market, how wages are set. And I just want to give you a taste of some of the assumptions that sit in the models, the kind of models on which claims like, if we cut the company tax rate, that's a great way to boost people's wages and it will create jobs. All right, this is the central claim of the Turnbull government's election campaign. Cutting the corporate tax rates will lead to higher wages and more jobs. All right, that's their claim. Fine, it's based on economic modelling. All right, what's assumed in the model? Well, the first thing to know about the kind of models that are used to this is they assume full employment. They assume full employment. In these models, everyone has a job. So when you ask these models, what's the impact of a policy change on employment, you don't get very interesting answers because the model actually assumes that we'll be at full employment. We can experience temporary moments of unemployment, but we're always heading back towards full employment. This is a pretty big assumption to make. Another, and I'll come to the corporate tax rate in a sec, but big picture, you've got to know what these models are sitting on. one of the things that, and let's just see, how many people here have done first year economics? Or more? Okay, good. All right. Apologies for the non-economists for a second. Remember how in first year we talk about opportunity cost in kind of lecture 1, hopefully, and then we talk about rational consumers, usually, or rational agents, usually in week 2 or 3, and rational people make decisions at the margin, all right? Economics, the kind of confusing but interesting bits of introductory economics are all about how important marginal things are, marginal cost, marginal benefit. Not many people know that in the CGE models that tell us about how rational people behave, there's no marginal tax rates. There's no marginal tax rates in the labour supply function of a CGE model. There's an average tax rate. Okay, this is, for the economists in the room, there's a big difference between an average tax rate and a marginal tax rate. But we've assumed that away. Right, but remember I said the models assume we've got rational people? Well, rational people make decisions based on marginal things. Yet rational people in this model have to make decisions based on average things. We don't know how that would work, but it doesn't matter. It's buried in the model. Don't worry too much about it. So let's now talk about the cut in the company tax rate and how it's going to make us all better off. So we cut the company tax rate, and that's going to lead to an increase in investment. All right? So the argument is, and it's an argument, that by increasing the post-tax rate of return, there'll be more investment in plant and equipment and stuff. All right? Might happen, that's an assumption. We then assume that the increase in investment has no impact. Like, let's imagine we cut the corporate tax rate and Coles goes and installs a whole bunch of self-checkout machines. All right, that would be Coles investing in new capital. And in the model, what happens is all the checkout workers not only instantly leave their checkout job and instantly get another job, they get another higher paying job. Because in the model, now that there's more capital in the economy, the productivity of labour goes up. And when the productivity of labour goes up, wages go up. So we cut the company tax rate. That stimulates investment. Maybe that works, maybe it doesn't. The new investment means that, that workers get higher wages because they're all employed in doing more productive tasks than they were before the investment took place. We don't worry in the model that the checkout operators might actually become unemployed. We don't worry in the model that the checkout operators might actually get a new job that's on lower wages. That couldn't happen. How do I know that couldn't happen? Well, because we assume it couldn't happen. So we cut the corporate tax rate, we get an increase in investment. The increase in investment makes everybody more productive, and all of the benefits of the productivity are automatically captured by the workers in the form of higher wages. What's the mechanism that drives this? How can we be sure that low-paid workers with no bargaining power would actually get that? We don't have to worry about that. The model just assumes it. And just like assuming that there's no friction or assuming that a bit of paper travels like a cannonball, it's up to us, the users of the model, to think, is that meaningful? Is that helpful? Is that realistic? Is it an imperfect but useful proxy of the reality we expect? Or is it a hopeless, meaningless assumption akin to confusing a cannonball with a bit of paper? That's a value judgment. It's a value judgment about the appropriateness of the simplifying assumptions. Yet the models are so opaque, I put it to you that few people are in any position to have a meaningful opinion on that, and indeed the policymakers waving the modelling around have probably got absolutely no idea. So we've assumed that cutting the company tax rate will lead to an increase in investment. We've assumed that increase in investment leads to higher productivity and don't worry about temporary unemployment. We've assumed that with higher productivity, wages automatically rise, and that allows us to conclude that cutting the corporate tax rate will give everyone a wage rise. Garbage in, garbage out. If the assumptions are valid, the conclusion might be valid. If the assumptions are rubbish, the conclusion will be rubbish. But there's no room in our public debate, or I'd even argue in our economic debate about this. Most academic economists kind of go, oh, modelling, yeah, I don't know, don't understand any of that. No one takes it seriously. While the public are kind of fed a daily diet of how important it is. So, again, come back to my initial point. Right? It's not that there are simplifying an assumption. It's not that there are simplifying assumptions in a model that's problematic. That's not problematic. What's problematic is using simplifying assumptions that are entirely inappropriate for the problem at hand. So, kind of what's gone wrong and where to from here. I wasn't around in the 1983 debates. I hear people speak longingly about them, but I can't really form a firm view. But I do know that we weren't relying on economic modelling when Nugget Coombs was giving policy advice. I do know that we weren't relying on CGE modelling when we did a lot of reforms in the 80s. I do know that economic modelling for a while was kind of the monopoly domain of government. Treasury was a heavy customer of modelling. Sure, academics were often generating it, primarily, I think, for government-related roles, and in turn, Treasury and other departments invested in their own modelling capacity. These days, the big users of modelling aren't governments trying to develop and sell policy, they're vested interests. Modelling has become a tool of advocacy. Now, it was always problematic, regardless of whether it's Treasury or the Productivity Commission or the Minerals Council. The assumptions are always contestable, and the debate about them has always been pretty poor quality. But I think it's become pretty obvious in the last 5 or 10 years with mining companies saying, that if I get to extend a coal mine, I'll create 44,000 jobs, or if we have a Pagovian tax that allows us to cut personal income taxes, it'll put a wrecking ball through the economy, or if we have a resource rent tax, then in the middle of the world's biggest commodity boom, no one would want to mine resources anymore. We've actually used economic modelling to do, I think economic modelling is now widely used by rent seekers selling a simple story. And the result, I think, is a political class that now is stuck. Because on the one hand, we've trained people in the last decade that modelling is proof that you're taking your policy seriously. And clever people, clever journalists, clever analysts say, but where's your modelling, Minister? Where's your modelling? And that was a kind of comfortable position until everyone realised that most of the modelling is just complete crap. So now we have this kind of dilemma where when announcing, well, I'd like to do this for education, where's the modelling? Where's the modelling? How can you prove what GDP will be in 50 years' time without modelling? And then, of course, when the modelling's presented, we say, well, that's rubbish, isn't it? It's got silly assumptions in it. So we're stuck. We're stuck. We don't actually seem to know how to have a meaningful, hard debate about what we want to do. Because we've kind of spent a decade turning to the modelling to tell us what we should do or what we shouldn't do. Yet people are increasingly becoming, rightly, deeply sceptical that the modelling might not really have the precision or the knowledge that we want. So again, as an economist, I sort of come back, for me, to first principles. We've got to think about the opportunity costs. Australia is one of the richest countries in the world. We live at the richest point in world history. It's quite frankly ridiculous to suggest that there's nothing we can't afford to do. Apparently we could afford to have a universal health system in the 80s, and despite the fact that GDP's doubled, we can't afford to have it anymore. What, of course, we mean by afford is don't want to pay for. There's a big difference between can't afford and don't want to pay for. And we find ourselves now in these ridiculous debates about what policy initiatives will cost and, who's the better economic manager over 10 years or 40 with the intergenerational report. So we now know, for example, that the problem with Labor is when they were in government, they made spending commitments that lasted longer than their term of office. Can you believe it? Do you know that that's what Labor did? They passed legislation that didn't cease when their parliament ceased. Can you believe how reckless and irresponsible that was? So we have a Labor government that got in and introduced new spending initiatives. We have a Liberal government that said the night before the election, we won't cut health, we won't cut education, we won't cut anything. Sounds like a policy commitment. Getting into office saying, well, the reason we're broke is their spending commitments. And if you said, well, what about Peter Costello's tax cuts? Might they have kind of had long-term consequences? No. Why not? Just not. That's not where we're starting the clock. We're starting the clock with what Labor did. So when Peter Costello cut taxes on very rosy GDP forecasts and said it was affordable, he was a genius. And when Wayne Swan and Labor put in health and education, NDIS spending commitments without perfect foresight for the next 20 years, they were idiots. We're stuck in this banal conversation about costings and forward estimates when actually there's far more interesting and important debates to have, like what do we want to spend more on, what do we want to spend less on, who do we want to collect the tax from, what's fair, what's right, what's good, what's efficient, and we can argue about it. But we can't do any of that because the modelling's getting in the way of all of it. So to wrap up, I think we, on the one hand, need to just kind of take a deep breath and understand that no one can tell us what the future will look like. No model can tell us what the future will look like. No one's right. No one has certainty. The decimal places are all rubbish. We need to spend more time thinking, if we care about modelling at all, we should care about the assumptions, not the conclusions. But actually, I think we should care about what we're doing today and how we think that sets us up for the future, rather than what the modelling says about what an imaginary future will look like. So big picture, I think we need to put modelling in its box. But small picture, if we are going to do modelling, then I feel very strongly that we need some form of code of conduct. We need some form of very clear accountability and transparency. We had the debacle a couple of months ago of the negative gearing modelling where we couldn't even know who paid for it, let alone how the assumptions were put together. I think if economists want to be taken seriously as a profession, and that's a big if, but if we want to be taken seriously as a profession, then I think we have obligations upon us to make clear to people what our assumptions are, to make clear to people what a sensitivity analysis would look like, to make clear to people who paid for our choice of particular assumptions. So let me just wrap up by again commending the incredible contribution that Professor Hancock has made to our understanding of how the labour market works in reality, and putting from putting the structural factors and the reality of a labour market front and centre in making decisions that have shaped our landmark cases that have shaped our labour market for decades, It wasn't economic modelling that drove harvest demand. It wasn't economic modelling that drove the wage system in Australia. It wasn't economic modelling that told us it was a good idea to look after our mates or be a land where where fairness was important. They were just values that once upon a time we thought were important, and apparently we're willing to give them up if economic modelling tells us we should. I hope not. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Richard, for all that insight and provocation as well as wisdom in what you were saying. I was certainly struck as I was listening to many years ago. I had as a lecturer at Monash the great Cambridge economist Joan Robinson, who was out there for a semester and took a whole course. And one of the things she introduced the course with was the aphorism that she said is Robinson's aphorism, which was the importance of studying economics is to learn how to avoid being deceived by economists. And Richard is a wake-up to these matters and these issues. So I think he's given us a great introduction to how that works out in practice and what we might even do about it in terms of codes of conduct and the like. The Academy of Social Sciences itself, by coincidence, was looking at issues in conjunction with the Productivity Commission as how to make modelling a transparent, open, contestable process, quite apart from going through court processes and evidentiary processes, which are, if you like, the A-grade version, but also other ways of making people more accountable for what they do by way of presentation of modelling results, where you hear a modelling firm present some evidence on behalf of a particular interest group, you try and get hold of the information about the modelling, the assumptions used, and you're just met with a blank wall and no way of accessing the evidence that was supposedly behind all this. So I think it's a great theme you've developed. We've got time for some Q&A, so first question up here. There is some microphones, so if you just wait on that. Yeah.
Hi, my name's... Oh, that's quite loud. My name's Taylor. Thank you for the fascinating lecture. It was something I'm sure everyone who's read the Daily Telegraph or any other paper in this country and seen a headline figure to really think about what does that mean, does it mean anything at all. One thing I am wondering is that even if there is more transparency about the modelling being done by private companies, let's say in the case of the corporate tax cut, you've got one firm that says it's going to cost $50 billion and not do very much for investment. You've got another firm that says it won't cost that much, or even if it does cost that much, it will produce a massive improvement to GDP, a massive improvement to the number of jobs, a massive improvement to wages. Even if you have the assumptions at the front of those papers, do people in the media have enough nous about economics to get the nuance across?
Look, very good question. The first thing I'd say is Google Stephen Long and Jennifer Westacott. Last week was a phenomenal interview by Stephen Long on the ABC about economic modelling, basically, and it should give us hope that there are good journalists out there, and to be honest, the main spokesperson for the company tax cut, I would suggest, did a pretty poor job of explaining why anyone should take the modelling seriously. Look, putting the assumptions up front is not in and of itself the solution, but it's a big help. Some of my colleagues, Dave Richardson down the front here, and I, we spend sometimes weeks reading through excruciatingly dull documents, which I describe as being written in a way that they were designed to never be read. The purpose of the report is to look authoritative. It's not a scientist explaining to another scientist how you might follow in my footsteps. It's a spin doctor hiding things, hiding needles in haystacks. So putting the assumptions, the big assumptions, right up front is in part, at least it says to the journalist or the other analyst reading it, you might want to think hard about this. And look, the actuaries have a very interesting approach to this. Some of the actuaries disclose their assumptions in 3 ways. One, sort of class A, B and C, and I'm verbaling them here, but class A, this is a standard assumption, everyone makes it all the time, it's the ABS life expectancy or whatever, right? This is what everyone does. B, this is my professional judgment. There is no good, there's no accepted wisdom on what number I should plug in here. And I'm willing to place my professional judgment on the line and say, of all the numbers I could come up with, pin this one on me. And if it's bad, come and laugh at me in a year's time. C, they paid me to do it. See what that forces you to do? Because there's a big difference, isn't there? Between, I'm willing to put my name to this report versus when I wrote this report, and I chose this assumption, this is me putting my professional integrity on the line, or you paying me a lot of money to put my professional integrity on the line. In the long run, I think that's quite useful.
Thank you.
Down the centre.
Thank you. Hello, Richard. My name's Peter. Thanks again for a provocative and interesting address. It seems to me that many of the people who rely heavily on economic modelling at the same time decry the climate modelling as being totally inaccurate. Do you share the same reservations about climate modelling?
Very good question. And I don't think you're a right-wing troll, but that is put to me on Twitter quite a lot. Like, you think climate change is real and you're picking on economic modelling. Like, there's some irony there. Here's the thing, what the climate model, and I'm not a climate scientist, but what the climate models are very open and evidence-based. And they're wrong all the time. So whenever new evidence gets collected, they keep incorporating the new evidence into their model. That's the point. And their models are getting better, which means they're wrong by less. And that's okay. Because they can't accurately predict the weather in 70 years' time yet. We can't predict interest rates in 70 days, yet we have a go at the climate modelers for not giving us enough certainty. So, the climate models are far more sophisticated in many ways than the economic models, far more sophisticated interrelationships between them. But the key variables, the key assumptions, the key linkages are evidence-based. And whenever new evidence comes along, they change them. Whereas the elasticity of demand for labour or the elasticity of investment in Australia to changes in tax is more of the feelings of the modeller than it is of evidence. We don't have it. So there are two, again, like with the actuaries, there are different categories. We can actually measure some things, and the things in the model are based on the best available data. But as for our assumptions about how labour supply changes with the tax rate, that's more to do with the hunch or the feeling of the modeller than it is lots of empirical evidence backing it up. And again, if it is lots of empirical evidence, they should stick it on the front, so we could all kind of say, well, what if you're wrong? Or what if you're wrong by 10%?
Good evening, my name's Alison. Something I thought that I wanted to bring up and see if you had any thoughts about it. Alongside the rise of quite abstract modelling, and we see that dominated in the public political sphere, is also the rise of the industry of consultancy. And I wondered if you had any comments about that. For me, it seems like it's deferring political risk from government, and it's sort of like you pay quite a large sum to a consultancy firm, and it creates another degree of separation between being accountable for your policy and the modelling that goes into it. So if you had any comments about that. But also, you concluded the lecture talking about the need to have a code of conduct around modelling, and I've been reading your stuff on this, and I think it'd be good to understand from your perspective what the instrument of creating that code of conduct looks like. What form does it take? and how do we begin shifting, public consciousness around this stuff?
Look, thank you. I think that I don't have a philosophical problem with governments buying in expertise they don't have. So the fact that governments might go to non-government organisations to get modelling is not in and of itself a problem. Indeed, they've been doing that through universities for decades. A lot of the better modellers were academics. So it's not the process or it's not the outcome of government contracting it out that's problematic, but I do think it's the loss of transparency that comes with that. Because the academic modellers that they used to outsource to were to some extent kind of going along with the idea of the actuarial assessment. The modellers didn't want to put their name, their academic credibility. A, they wanted to tell people what was in the model, and B, it was an intellectual exercise for them. So I think that the real strength of outsourcing modelling to the bigger commercial consulting houses is the complete lack of an FOIable email trail, the complete lack of a Senate estimates process where you can sit the modeller down and say, really, this thing here where you say that cutting the corporate tax rate will lead to an increase in productivity, doesn't America have one of the highest GDP per capita in the world? Yep. Don't they have high company tax rates? Yep. Could you talk us through that? So by pushing all that off to KPMG or PwC, and I should add PwC said only 2 months ago that cutting the company tax rate would pay for itself in its entirety within 5 years. PwC got front page, cut the company tax rate, it'll pay for itself in 5 years' time, and then it's all land and milk and honey stuff. Now we've got Treasury and everyone else's modelling saying, oh, maybe in 20 years' time it'll still cost us a fortune, but it's worth doing anyway, right? So these PwC have shredded their credibility, from my point of view, on that one claim, but of course no one remembers. I think it's the lack of accountability rather than the outsourcing that's the problem. The best modellers should do the best modelling, but it should be transparent all the way through. The second part of your question, how would a code of conduct kind of work? Well, there's a really simple bit, there's a real simple opportunity here. The vast majority of modelling, I'll go back a step. Former students of mine are economic modellers. I won't name them tonight. They work for the people I've just described. I've been playing this game for many years now. I feel very confident when I say private companies do not commission macroeconomic modelling to do anything other than persuade government. BHP doesn't do macroeconomic modelling to make BHP's decisions. Rio Tinto doesn't pay macroeconomic modellers to help them make Rio Tinto's decisions. The Commonwealth Bank doesn't pay macroeconomic modellers to make them make Commonwealth Bank decisions, but they all spend a fortune paying modellers to persuade government. Now, this gives government incredible power in this transaction, because governments need to simply say, well, we actually think modelling should be transparent, open, repeatable, and anyone that wants to persuade us of anything, the modelling has to conform to the following standards. It's a free country. You can pay a corrupt consultant to say anything you want. But don't come knocking on our doors, don't go talk to our bureaucrats, unless your modelling conforms to these minimum standards. So it's a little bit of behavioural economics, but we can actually co-opt the whole market for modelling simply by saying unless it reaches a certain level, don't use it to persuade us. Waste your own money on it if you want, but if you want to float it out there in public debate, it should reach minimum standards of accountability. So I think there's enormous capacity for state and federal governments to kind of drive the modelling market in a good direction if they want to.
Well, I did say that was the last question, but...
One very quick comment. Leaving aside all the self-interested reasons for choosing one assumption or another, I think you said it was something to do with values, and that's the key. When people are being themselves, they choose what fits in with their worldview, their ideology, their religion. Secondly, you mentioned, what if we did an economic model in 1981-82 to predict something about future policy? Well, I did.
How wrong were you?
And, I was right.
By the way, John was one of my PhD examiners, so he must be right.
And the model was predicted. The prediction that was right and which was asked of the model was, would Labor policy reduce inflation under the abnormally high level of the Fraser government? And the answer was yes. And it did.
Good.
Now, why it did it, it was small enough so that you could actually see what caused what. And that, I think, is the answer to having economic models that really work. If they're very big, they're black boxes. If they're small enough so you know what caused what, they're good. Or at least you can tell whether they're good or not.
Look, I agree, and I guess what I'd say is that when you've got a simple model that the user understands well, you can then be a better judge of whether the model is appropriate for the question that's being asked. And building these big black boxes actually makes it harder to make decisions about, is the model appropriate or not.
Some final comments from Keith Hancock, who has the lecture named after him.
Well, the first thing clearly I want to say is to thank Richard for a stimulating and extraordinarily well put together presentation, which I appreciated greatly. It brought to mind a couple of experiences that I had. One was I was sitting on a national wage case bench, and we had a professional economist who'd been called by an interest group, was the National Farmers Federation, and was offering us the prescription that if we were to increase minimum wages, would cause a particular reduction in employment. And I asked a number of questions of this economist, and I must say he said that this was a conclusion derived from general equilibrium modelling. So I asked some questions about what was in the black box, and it turned out that the reduction in employment, which followed from an increase in the wage, was one of the assumptions of the model. My 6 colleagues on the bench who were non-economists were quite appalled, as I was. The other experience, which raises somewhat different questions, and it's relevant to what you said about actuaries foreseeing some things with confidence and not just backing their personal judgments. And you instanced ABS population projections, I think. Back in the 1970s, I chaired an inquiry into national superannuation. It ended up nothing came of it. The government didn't adopt the proposal that we put. But we did offer a proposal for a national superannuation scheme. And when you're doing that, you really do have to look a long way into the future. And we relied on the ABS population projections as they then stood. What was especially important was their projections about age structure, and you'll understand why that's important in a superannuation context. Well, in fact, it's turned out that the projections were unduly optimistic, and if our scheme had gone ahead on the basis of those projections, we'd now be finding it underfunded. Now, I don't know what can be done about that, because if, for example, you are going to have a superannuation scheme, you really do have to look a long way into the future, and you do have to model things like population. So I just have a residual question in my mind as to just how far you can discredit modelling. But thank you again, Richard. It was a really great lecture.
Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Richard, and all of you. We are going to retire to the Peninsula Room, and I'm told we'll be directed where that is for canapes and drinks for those who'd like to join us there. I'd leave with one word at the end of the themes that have been developed. J.K. Galbraith once said that he was terribly impressed by the model of Vasily Leontief's work, because right or wrong, it was always accurate to 2 decimal places.